Well, good morning again. My name is Jed Halvorson. I'm a pastoral intern here at Grace Saskatoon. If you've only recently begun gathering with us here on Sundays, you won't know who I am. I've been gone all month. Now, that said, if we have never met, please come introduce yourself to me later. I would love to meet you. But my wife would warn you, I'm terrible at remembering names. So my apologies in advance. Now, as a pastoral intern here, I'm getting trained by our elders in areas such as preaching, and how the goal of preaching is not to give an inspirational speech, but rather to help people meet and be transformed by a relationship with Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I certainly benefit from refreshing my mind by focusing on who Jesus is, the one true God who became one of us, to serve me by doing everything necessary for my acceptance with God. I need to be reminded of his care and his love for me, how he is powerful, how he is worthy of trust, even when I don't see it or I don't know what God is doing in this world. The reminder that we can trust and obey him even when we don't feel like it. That's a simple question. How many times in this last week did you not feel like trusting and following Jesus? We gather today to cast our eyes back onto Jesus, to clearly see who our God is, that we might worship him. And now we're opening our Bibles with the goal of remembering who he is and that he is worth trusting. Even when God doesn't seem visible in our circumstances, even when we cannot trace his hand, we can trust his heart. And that's something worth remembering. If you don't have a Bible, we do still have a few on the table over there by where you entered. Feel free to grab one at any time. So for the past month and a bit, we've been working our way through the book of Ruth. Ruth is a short book near the beginning of the Bible, right after the books Joshua and Judges. Today we're beginning Ruth chapter 4. If you're like me and you haven't been here for a few weeks, or you're like me in that you're quite gifted in forgetting things quickly, then it would help to know what has happened so far in this book. So far in the book of Ruth, we've met a few people named Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth. Ruth was married to one of Naomi's sons. But tragedy struck, and both Naomi's husband and her sons die. So Ruth and Naomi are forced to fend for themselves in a culture where that was not an easy thing to do. And so they move from the nation of Moab, where they were living, back to Israel, back to Naomi's homeland, God's people, where she had left, where there had been a 10-year famine that had now ended. And long story short, as they're back in Israel, Ruth and Naomi begin to be provided for by Boaz, a man who was a close relative of Naomi's now dead husband. In the book of Ruth, Boaz is a faithful man or a hero who points us to Jesus through his character and his care for Ruth and Naomi. Despite there being a food shortage, he has trusted and followed God by giving these women food. More food than he would be required to by law, because Boaz will not let fear stop him from trusting God and loving these women, even though it's costing him personally. And as we saw last week, since this Boaz is a close relative, that means that he can act as a kinsman redeemer. And he also can rightfully marry and care for Ruth, and then by extension Naomi, through the law of levirate marriage, where if one's husband died, their close relative could marry the widow to uphold the dead husband's name, legacy, inheritance, honor. And see, in chapter 3, we see there's this budding romance between between Ruth and Boaz. Now. And on top of that, there is a plot twist as their romance is blossoming. When Ruth approaches Boaz in verse 12 of chapter 3, asking him to act as a redeemer, where she's basically asking him to marry her. Boaz responds, "It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. In the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you." So let's not misunderstand this here. Everything points to Boaz wanting to marry Ruth. We see that again today. But what we find in Boaz's response is exactly what we don't find in today's movies, romance novels, whatever. Even though Boaz would love to marry Ruth, he is not letting his feelings control his actions. He knows it is more important that he obeys God and does things God's way than just marrying Ruth immediately. See, Boaz knows that there is a redeemer who is more closely related to Naomi's dead husband Elimelech, one who has more of a right to act as a redeemer than Boaz does, buying Elimelech's property to care for Naomi and Ruth. And Boaz knows that if the other man wishes to act as a redeemer, then the honorable and common sense action would be that the other man also marry Ruth, upholding both laws, the law of kinsman redemption and the law of levirate marriage. The idea here that the Redeemer should do both, keep the whole counsel of God, not just one law or the other, aiming to follow all that God reveals. A trust shown by his obedience here, even if it means going against his feelings. Boaz here is trusting God to the point where he is willing to not marry Ruth because his love for God is greater than his love for Ruth. And if the other man decides to both redeem by buying the property and marry Ruth, well, Boaz says, good. Because then Naomi and Ruth will still be redeemed and cared for. See, he's trusting God and seeking the best of others, not himself. That's a mark of true love, isn't it? And so, with that setting, we come to Ruth chapter 4, with the widow Ruth putting her hope and trust in Boaz, and Boaz putting his trust in God, saying he will go sort this thing out with the other man. So let's read Ruth chapter 4 and see what happens next.
Reading from Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who's come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah, and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David.
What an interesting text, eh? The exchange of a sandal, a legal conversation about who will act as a redeemer and who will marry Ruth. This isn't exactly a scene from the season finale of The Bachelorette, the drama of 2 men fighting for the love of 1 woman. But there is more happening in this scene, and more that this scene points to than we may realize. Isn't Boaz's love for Ruth on the line here? And doesn't the outcome of this conversation have massive implications for Ruth and Naomi? Will the one who redeems them be acting out of love for themselves or for the women and God? A love seen not only in redeeming the land, but in also taking that caregiving role of the loving husband for Ruth. Was Boaz right to trust God in this way? What message of hope does the book of Ruth give us as we decide to follow our feelings or obey God even when our feelings disagree? Is our trust in God all for nothing? Let's dive right in. In verse 1, Boaz does exactly what he says he would do. He immediately goes to find the other relative in the morning. Boaz didn't give himself time to talk himself out of this decision to obey God. So perhaps you're like me here instead of Boaz, where when I make a decision, a commitment to trust and obey God in some way, and then I just sit back and don't immediately do it. Other thoughts and arguments from my mind, they just begin to explain to me, well, how I don't really need to obey God in this way. Well, I don't really feel like I should. And then somehow, I later find that I never actually acted on my decision to obey God. Curious. Anyone else really good at that? A really easy example from my own life is with money. Say I have some extra money and I say to myself, oh, I don't need this. I'll give it to the church for the ongoing advance of the gospel, in obedience to Jesus, showing I trust God with my money. Wow, I think, good job, Jed. But then somehow, that money just stays in my wallet. Other thoughts and worries have come into my head, explaining to me all the reasons why I shouldn't trust God in this way. At least you had the thought, Jed. That's good. And then later, all of a sudden, I find the money was spent in other ways. Boaz could have just said, oh, you know, Ruth, there is another man who could redeem and marry you. Yeah, I'll go talk about it next time I run into him. And then never actually go looking for him. Just giving himself plenty of time for other thoughts and arguments to explain why he should just marry Ruth instead of trusting God. You leave me alone with my thoughts for long enough, and I will provide you with many reasons why I should hold off on following God in this or that way. But what is clear in Boaz's action here, what's so cool about it, is that he demonstrates his trust in God by immediately seeking out this other man. He was trusting God, and it showed. And then here's another question worth considering. Does your life point to the fact that your faith and trust is in God or yourself? Do we comfort ourselves with the fact that we obey some of what God commands, while there are other clear commands that we ignore or avoid? You wouldn't have to look back further than this morning to find me failing to perfectly trust God. But how sweet it is, even in the face of my failure to trust God perfectly, even in the Christian struggle to trust God, our lives point to Jesus, the one that Boaz reminds us of, the Son of God himself who perfectly trusted the Father to the point of dying on the cross in our place, our Redeemer, saving us from our rebellion and sin. Where now, even despite our sin, our struggles to fully trust him, he is gracious to us and continues to teach us how he alone is truly worthy of our trust. And that's what I think is ultimately on the line here for Boaz in this point. Boaz has put his faith and trust in God. He could have just followed his feelings, could have just married Ruth, but he understands that trusting God can sometimes mean not trusting our feelings, especially when our feelings and God disagree. Because God knows what's truly best for us, and Boaz believes that. And now he's going to see how it plays out. So Boaz heads to the gate that people had to travel through, waited for the other man to appear, and voila, God providentially ensures that the other man walks by. And so Boaz says, "Hey, come sit down with me." And the other man does. And then verse 2, another cool thing, it just reveals more of Boaz's trust in God. Verse 2, and he, that's Boaz, took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Look how Boaz is approaching this situation. He's acting so honorably that he doesn't just want to talk with the other potential redeemer one-on-one. He also goes and gets witnesses for the conversation. Witnesses who know God's heart and commands, who can hold him accountable. Boaz understands that trusting God even means bringing others into the conversation as it's happening, as he and this other man decide who will act as a redeemer for the women, who will marry Ruth. And again, isn't that just the opposite of how we want to operate? Where we instead are far more comfortable at times just making decisions and solving problems by ourselves. Where we naturally only want to get other people involved once we've already made the decision. Because what if they change our mind? That prideful thought, I'm the only one who can be trusted here. That God can't be trusted to work through his church and the wisdom that's there. Pride can lead to secrecy, but a trust in God, it just leads to this vulnerability, this humility, openness, where we don't have to have everything figured out before going public, before bringing things into the wisdom of community. And then look at Boaz here. He trusts God enough that he will seek out the other redeemer and he will do it publicly. This means that even if the other man does choose to both act as redeemer and marry Ruth, Boaz can't just run off and quickly marry Ruth before anyone could stop him. No, because there's others, there's witnesses of the event who can hold him accountable to it. Boaz seeks to honor God and follow his revealed will as best he can. So then again, here's the setting for our chapter, conversation between our two finalists, our two potential kinsman redeemers, two men who are supposed to act against selfish tendencies and use their resources to serve, represent, and redeem others. And in verses 3 and 4, the conversation begins. Then he, Boaz, said to the other man, the other redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. Again, when talking about the land, we're talking about a way that one could act as a redeemer, where, in other words, if you were my relative, and I, like Naomi, had to sell some land because I was poor and unable to look after it, then as a redeemer, you would buy that land and use it in ways that benefit from me. And you would keep me from having to sell myself into poverty. Thanks for that. So here again, we get a glimpse of how kinsmen redeemers are one of those descriptions in the law that point us to Jesus, don't we? Just as Boaz, or this other redeemer, will at cost to themselves pay to redeem Naomi's land, so too has Jesus paid the greatest price, his own life, to act as our Redeemer. A redemption that touches even this land, even this broken, sin-cursed world, where Jesus redeems what was lost when man rebelled. A world without death, evil, suffering. A world where God walked with man on the earth. A land and a relationship with God that was lost because of our sin. A redeemer brings the family that lost the blessing of their home and inheritance and restores it to them. And when Jesus returns as king, we will have our full restoration. When God comes to dwell again with us, we are welcomed into his presence, into that world without pain, suffering, death. Oh, does that sound like a place where you would want to live? I can't wait. If you have placed your faith in Jesus, that is your inheritance. Everything lost by our forefather in the garden, restored, redeemed, and so much more. That's the full picture that we're catching a blurry image of here in Ruth. Boaz and this other man are discussing Elimelech's land because they're called to act here, to pay the cost to redeem the land and thus help Naomi in her poverty. And so Boaz brings the matter up to the other redeemer. And what's his response? At the end of verse 4, and he said, I'll do it. I will redeem it. Sure, I'll buy the land. I wonder if Boaz's heart just sunk a little there. Because, this man is willing to act as a redeemer. Maybe he is a godly man who will desire to obey all that God has commanded. Maybe he will also marry Ruth. So, verse 5, then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also require Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. If that first kinsman redeemer is going to obey all that God has commanded, so not just as redeemer, but also marrying Ruth, bringing forth children for Mahlon's ongoing genealogy, so that the family will receive his inheritance for ongoing generations, so that Naomi and Ruth will have children to care for them when they're old, then this also means whoever acts as redeemer and buys the land, they have to be acting selflessly. Whoever acts as redeemer and buys the land would not personally benefit from the land forever. For that would rightfully belong to Elimelech's line, through Ruth's child. Ruth's child would have a legal claim on that land, so catch that. It is through keeping both laws that these two women will be fully cared for, so they could make use of the redeemed land, enjoy the inheritance forever down the line. That little picture of how Jesus, in redeeming us, also ensures we will enjoy the full inheritance and new creation. And how sweet is that? Here we are. Boaz has laid it all out on the line. The right to marry Ruth is first the duty of this other man. He has that right. Boaz's heart could be racing. Because now comes the moment. The man's heart is about to be revealed. Is he truly a worthy man who seeks to do both? Is he a man who trusts and obeys God even when it's inconvenient? Is the love story over? Let's read all of verses 6 again together. The other man says to Boaz, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the matter of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. That was, as a side note, that was simply a cultural custom of that day. I don't have much to say there. It may have morphed over time from some instruction God gave, or if a Redeemer doesn't want to act as a Redeemer, we can't know. But if you think it's strange, just think how a handshake today would have looked weird to them maybe. So continuing in verse 9, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife. Yes. To perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. The other man did not want to marry Ruth. So you can see how that's sad for the other man, because he did not want to fully follow God, fully act as he should. And with that, oh, what a love story. End scene, roll the credits. Good night, everyone. But just hold on. Why didn't the first man want to act as a redeemer? What changed? Does he know something Boaz doesn't? I don't think so. I think what this scene highlights is the difference between Boaz and this other man. The difference between seeking first your own good or the good of other people. Loving yourself or others more. So see, the first man, remember, he was really happy to act as a redeemer so long as he was gaining something. He had to pay a cost, yeah, but in just redeeming the land, he was paying a cost to increase his own land, to increase his own wealth and property. More land to raise herds, grow crops on. So in short, this was not a personal sacrifice. This was an investment. Especially since Naomi didn't have any children who would grow up and later claim the land. And then I think that's why having to marry Ruth and have a child with her just changes things immediately. Because then his act of redemption has to be selfless. See verse 6. To help Ruth and Naomi in this way would change his own inheritance. Because when Ruth's son grows up, he would rightfully inherit Naomi's land and probably more from the man. So as soon as it cost him, he was unwilling to help Naomi and Ruth. Here again, don't we see a way that sin just corrupts our relationships with each other? Where man's ability to help and redeem others is limited by our self-centered, self-focused, sinful hearts. Where we don't truly trust that God can care for all our needs and we can dedicate ourselves to serving others. This is what we looked at earlier. Sin makes us self-focused. Our rebellion and rejection of God has corrupted every aspect of our relationships with each other. It keeps us focused on our feelings, our desires. I mean, this is so obvious when it comes to acts that would require a selfless sacrifice on our part to help others. If we're honest, we are far more like the other Redeemer who was happy to help as long as he clearly saw the benefits. Oh, think of the benefits for me. People will see me helping and praise me. Oh, I may be helping this person, but I'm definitely getting something back in return. In other words, I want to do this because of me. But when our help requires some form of personal cost, we are far more hesitant to jump in and help others who need it. When all the benefit goes to the other person, now see that would take a lot of time and resources. I would rather spend my time helping somewhere people would notice. Could I help in a way that doesn't cost me so much? Another question. How often when you help someone, are your thoughts more fixed on yourself than the one needing help? For Ruth and this first kinsman redeemer, the system of redemption was in place, but just the existence of a system did not address the problem of the human heart. The sin, self-centeredness, that was still there. It is still here. Why? Because humans are still God-rejecting, self-loving creatures in their hearts. And so the man basically says to Boaz, I cannot act as redeemer. That doesn't work well for me. Boaz, you do it. Because he is so focused on his felt needs, he cannot focus on the real needs of others. His eyes don't seem to be on Ruth and Naomi and the help that they need. His love for himself blinds him of his lack of love for others. Do we ever think that way? I do. And here's the good news again, but God is so good and he is so gracious that we find even in this story, in his continued care for Ruth and Naomi, all throughout this book, and now with Boaz, he ensures they are not redeemed by a man who cares mainly for himself. Instead, God has provided Boaz, a man who acts first, not out of a love for himself, but for God and these two women. A man who trusts God even when he didn't know how it would end. He had no idea when this conversation started. He is one who is free to truly love Naomi and Ruth, regardless of any cost, because he most fully trusts and fully loves God, not himself. And in that, we see that hero type in Boaz that points us to Jesus. But we should also note that there is a type of contrast here between Boaz and Jesus. Contrast, Jed? What contrast? Boaz was faithful. He trusted God. What possible contrast could there be here? Well, yeah, Boaz was faithful. But unlike Jesus, in the story of Boaz, we see that his faithfulness, his trust, it immediately pays off. He gets the girl. But trusting in God and his plan doesn't always immediately bring such reward. Has your life ever been made harder or more difficult because of your decision to trust Jesus? Don't mistake this as a message. Don't mistake Ruth chapter 4 as a message to trust God and watch him richly bless you with prosperity, health, wealth, land, here and now. That's not the message the gospel brings. The message of the gospel is that Jesus came to redeem us from our sin as the fullness of what Boaz here only points to. And Jesus redeems us by going above and beyond what Boaz could ever achieve for Ruth and Naomi by perfectly trusting and obeying his Father. And that resulted not in Jesus' deliverance from suffering and death, but his trust in his Father ensured his suffering and death. Where on that cross he took upon himself all the suffering and death that we deserve for our sin, for our rebellion, for our selfishness, our lack of willingness to seek the good of God and others before ourselves. Jesus is that ultimate kinsman redeemer, is he not? Absolutely he is. One who is willingly paid, one who has willingly paid that cost to redeem us, even though he knew full well that our redemption would cost his life. And that is true love. Jesus could have just redeemed us. He could have stopped there, saved us from hell, That would have been wonderful in itself. But he also loves us. And so he goes further, receiving us into a relationship where we are safe, where we are fully known and yet fully loved. And by living, being tempted, suffering, and dying as a human, Jesus knows our struggles and pain better than anyone else. He knows how hard it can be to trust God. Just think of him in the garden in Matthew chapter 26, verse 39, where he knows that in less than 24 hours he will be on a cross suffering and dying. Think of his wrestling with doubts, and yet ultimate trust, ultimate submission to the Father, where he cries out in agony, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Jesus certainly did not feel like suffering here. We see that in his cry. And yet he chose to continue fully trusting God to the point of death. For he knew who his loving and gracious Father is. He knew the joy awaiting him in his union with all who have been redeemed by him. And trusting his Father to unfold the best story to the point of death, paying that ultimate redemption price, Jesus has fully opened the door to salvation, and he is saving people. God the Father fully vindicated Jesus' trust in him by raising him from the dead to where Jesus now reigns as king over all. The Redeemer of all who come to him, the King of all creation, who will one day return to renew this earth, and reign, where all who have died having trusted him shall have their hope and their faith vindicated, their faith made sight. It's that simple question that we still wrestle with every day. Can God be trusted? When we struggle to trust God, we must cast our eyes back onto Jesus, what he has done, that he is powerful and he is seeking our best because he loves us. He loves us. It's really easy to forget that when we're struggling to trust him. You don't get a better redemption story than Jesus the Redeemer, do you? That's why the witness's blessing on Boaz and Ruth's marriage is so fitting. Ending verses 11 and 12, Ruth 4. Then all the people who were at the gate, all the witnesses, all the elders, and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman, Ruth, who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Their blessing is a sweet one that points to the two women who gave birth to those 12 tribes of Israel and to the house of Perez, a house that was mighty and well known despite its sinful beginnings. In other words, what they're pointing to here is stories of God's faithfulness. And they're again calling on the Lord that he will bless Boaz and Ruth's child in such a way that people will be forced to say, that was God. As we will see next week, these witnesses, they had no idea how greatly God would bless Boaz and Ruth's lineage, their descendants, where God is so faithful and he's so good that he chooses to honor Boaz and Ruth, ensuring that their family line would one day give birth to Jesus, our great Redeemer. How cool is that? Boaz had no idea what God was going to do when this all started. Yet he trusted God and followed him anyway, and God delighted to work through Boaz's obedience. And now today, we have an advantage that Boaz did not, because we know how the story ends, how this world ends, and how it's made into something better. With Jesus returning in all his glory, wiping away every tear. On that day, nobody will say they trusted God in vain, will they? We will only wonder why we didn't trust him more. That's the question for all of us today. Who will I trust? Trust Jesus or trust yourself? There's no middle ground option for any of us. If you have never before put your trust in Jesus, please do not wait to do so. And to all of us, oh, why wait to trust our God when he has dealt so kindly with us, when he has come to redeem us, paying the greatest cost imaginable to save us? Our God is most worthy of our trust, and no cost for trusting Jesus will ever come close to the joy that awaits those of us who trust him. So let's end by praying to him now and asking for the strength to trust him more. Jesus, help us in this. We are so weak in our faith. We're so weak in our trust. Forgive us for it. And thank you for coming as our Redeemer, having forgiven us for our weak trust, for our weak faith. Father, give us grace and strength in this next week as we go out from here, as we scatter, to be those who learn to trust you more, who cast our eyes more onto you. Holy Spirit, please cast our eyes back onto Jesus, as we're so quick to do the opposite. Help us in this all and give us wisdom in our relationships with each other that we may cast their eyes back onto Jesus, how you are most worthy of trust, Jesus. In Jesus' name, everyone said, amen.